Okay, great. So, thanks for joining our webinar. Welcome to everyone. This is a webinar on building partnerships with energy auditors and project contractors. I'm Greg Leventis. I am a policy researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And before we get started, I would like to thank the Department of Energy's Office of State and Community Energy Programs, and particularly Sean Williamson and Emily Slusser for their support of this work and for all of the work that they're doing and supporting to help state energy offices successfully implement federal funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. We're very lucky to have Rebecca Olson from the Center for Energy and Environment with us today to present on partnerships with auditors and contractors. She is a senior director of residential and community energy at CEE, where she leads a team that brings energy efficiency solutions to residents, owners, and communities. Becky has worked in energy efficiency for nearly 20 years, and during that time, she's done everything from actually being an auditor to actually being a program director. So she has been where the rubber meets the road on these issues. She also has the pulse of the industries through serving on boards of groups such as Minnesota Building Performance Association, the Building Performance Institute, or BPI as you might know it, Standards Technical Committee, and the Minneapolis Energy Vision Advisory Committee. So I'm really excited about this presentation. But a few housekeeping pieces. First, this, again, you're in the right place if you have come for the Building Successful Partnerships with Energy Auditors and Project Contractors. What we want to do today is provide information on how to effectively partner with energy auditors and project contractors for revolving loan fund programs. We will, if we have time at the end, we will have a brief question and answer session. But a few things there. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, and if you want to make comments in the chat. Also, the recording, as I said, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording is going to be available as well as a slide deck in the next few days. An important note: we originally scheduled, so this is like our previous webinar on building successful partnerships with third-party program administrators and financial institutions. This also has a corresponding office hours. Our office hours were originally scheduled for a different day. It is now Tuesday, July 9th, at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern. It should have changed on your calendar, but please check to make sure that it is now on Tuesday, July 9th at 1 p.m. And also note that the recording of our previous webinar that I was just talking about on partnerships with lenders and program administrators is now available. This link will be here when the slides are available. And finally, there are plenty of really great resources at the link at the bottom. Skep has put together revolving loan fund technical assistance resources, which are there's great stuff there. And also there is a button there where you can click to request free technical assistance. So turning to today, first, I'm going to go over a few of the foundations for the partnerships with auditors and contractors. So reviewing some terminology, roles of the partnership partners and the life cycle, characteristics of good partnerships, and then some requirements for the RLF program. After that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky. She's going to talk about recruiting auditors and contractors, and then she's going to talk about designing auditor and contractor friendly programs so that we can get these folks involved as best as possible. And then that will also touch on driving uptake through contractor networks. And then I will go over some resources that are available. So first, to put all of this into some perspective, by partnership, what we were talking about here is an arrangement in which two or more parties agree to cooperate to advance their mutual interests. In this case, it is furthering clean energy through financing. And the revolving loan fund program partners can include, and I'm going to start at the bottom here. There are plenty of folks that it can include, but in the more formal aspects, it's often lenders, program administrators, if there's going to be a third-party program administrator, and then the focus of our webinar today, project contractors. So these are the folks who are actually making the improvements to the buildings, and then energy auditors. So these are folks who are assessing the energy needs of the buildings and identifying where energy might be being wasted, and most importantly, identifying opportunities to improve the efficiency of the buildings. Now, in terms of roles, generally the way we can think about the program itself in phases and like what the role of each partner would be, you can think of these in terms of the program design phase, the establishing partnerships phase, and the program execution phase. And as you can see, partners, and especially auditors and contractors, are important in all of these phases. So, we noted down here primarily focusing on establishing partnerships and execution, but they auditors and contractors, as Becky will talk about, can also be very important in the program design phase, because you want to get their input so that you're designing a program that's going to work best for everybody. And then, of course, you need to establish partnerships with them. This can be everything from developing documents and agreements, navigating procurement, negotiating with them, vetting potential partners. And then finally, of course, there are program actually needs to execute projects, and these are the folks who do it. So they are going to be implementing it, and program sponsors and program administrators will be monitoring that, adapting, troubleshooting, etc. Now, in terms of characteristics of effective partnerships, here are a few that our colleague Jeff Pitkin has laid out. First is open communication. So this can include regular status reports or meetings. It is better to be over-transparent than under-transparent, so that you can find out what's working well and what needs to be addressed. The next piece is accessibility, and this is making sure that team members on all teams have access to each other, so that open communication can be achieved. Then there's flexibility. So it's great to keep your goal front and center, but it's unlikely that everything is going to go exactly as planned. So being prepared and flexible is key to overcoming curveballs. Then there is complementary strengths and recognizing what, for example, the state energy office's experiences and strengths are, and what the partners' strengths are, so that you can make sure that you're taking full advantage of both of those. Then there are measurable results. So a plan for measuring outcomes should be included in every agreement. And some of these things, like maybe number of projects financed, can be very straightforward, whereas others, like customer satisfaction, might not be as straightforward, but can still be important to include. And then finally, there is commitment. So if you promise to do something, set a date for it, and commit to have it done by then. So just making sure that all partners involved are committed to achieving the same goals. Now, the IIJA, as I mentioned, the funding from that has audit requirements and recommendations for both retrofits for both commercial and residential projects. And this is everything from using specific evaluation criteria to the eligibility of improvements and suggestions on tools to use. So you can find these in the RLF capitalization grant application, but the link will be here for you when we post these slides. But these underline the importance of having good partnerships with auditors and contractors. So I'm now going to turn it over to Becky to talk about recruitment.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks to LBNL and DOE for having me on today. I am coming from the perspective of designing and administering multiple programs in my market in Minnesota, but have a sense of what things are how things are happening in other states. So I'm going to try to speak as well as I can to the markets, but I want to note too that every market is a little different. Hopefully you know a fair amount of the structure of things in your state, and if not, I've got some recommendations for how to sort of start to get that knowledge base built. As Greg mentioned, I've been doing work in energy efficiency for almost 2 decades, and have worked on the ground as an energy auditor, worked with funders and states, utilities, federal governments to try and figure out the best ways to deploy energy efficiency programs and projects. And then my organization, Center for Energy and Environment, is also the largest nonprofit lender in the state of Minnesota. So we also lend out a lot of funds. So I've learned a lot of lessons on how lending and capital stacking can kind of play into program deployment. So that's my perspective, and that's kind of what expertise I'm bringing to you today. So hopefully I can answer any questions at the end. I think we'll have some time at the end, as well as the office hours in a couple weeks. All right, next slide. Okay, so first, figuring out who are the players in your market, how to find them. We came up with a few different options, but of course there's going to be more than this potentially, and they might vary from state to state. Tried to group this into kind of more residential focus versus commercial, and then some areas where you might be able to go and recruit that have both. So on the residential side, typically including multifamily, weatherization assistance program providers are across the country. Many of you or your colleagues may work directly with those program providers, and they have energy auditors typically on staff, and then also work with subcontractors, and some may even have construction crews on staff. So it's a good network to tap into if they're available. I will note that they're also very busy right now. They have a lot of funding. And so depending on your market, they may or may not have the ability to kind of take on more work. So just noting that, but it's a nice framework and it exists across the country. The Building Performance Association is a trade association. They have members that are energy auditors and contractors. It is primarily focused on residential, but it's a nice place to look. They have some published resources for all sorts of things: workforce development, training, education, as well as engagement with the contractor network. Building Performance Institute is sort of a sister organization and works a lot in tandem with BPA, and provides the standards and certification protocols. And they have a lot of resources on who is already certified they have several certifications for residential energy auditors, for technicians, I believe HVAC as well now. So they have lists of people actually that you can reach out to. And then ResNet is really the system that HERS raters utilize. So if you have a large group of HERS raters in the state, they're going to be typically more working on new construction, but there are some programs that utilize HERS ratings in the ResNet network as well for existing rehab and particularly affordable housing. And then in some states, the Home Energy Score, which is a DOE program, has more market penetration than others. So if you're in a state that has Home Energy Score practitioners, that is a resource to tap into as well. On the commercial side, you're going to have more people on the sort of engineering consulting firm side doing energy audits. They're typically going to be enrolled or on lists of providers for utility programs. So that's a good one to tap into as you start to develop these partnerships. The Association for Energy Engineers has a certification protocol for some energy auditors, and then ASHRAE has protocols for audit types. So those are some other resources to tap into on the commercial side. I had mentioned the utility program contractors and vendor lists. That's going to be a really good place to start if you are in a state that has a very robust utility program framework. Not all states do, but if you do have one of those, a lot of times utility programs will have lists of contractors that have met certain criteria, have agreed to certain terms and conditions. So it's another good place to start, particularly on the contractor side. Contractor trade associations can be a really good place to start, particularly minority contractor trade association, women-owned contractor trade associations, to try and make this more equitable and getting to the people that we want to make sure are having access to these programs. And then program implementers typically work with utility programs. They might be a little harder to find because they're not published necessarily, but if you have program implementers that typically work for utilities, that's another good place to start for energy auditors as well as contractor networks. Okay, next slide. So once you've kind of found this space, you want to do some digging as to what training you might need to develop for educating some of these partners. So almost assuredly, you're going to need to train these partners on the program requirements, because with every new program, there are different sets of requirements. Who's eligible for these funding projects, what kind of reporting is required by different partners in this system, what timeline do they have, both on the whole program, but also on a per project basis. If you have specific criteria for how long an audit can take place before you want to start entering into construction, those things are going to be important for all these players to know. If there are any approval touch points, either by the state offices or implementation partners or lender partners, if there are any sort of touch points in there that the auditor and contractor networks need to understand. And I'm sure there's a whole slew of other things that are sort of program specific, requirement related things that you'll want to think about. What kind of training is needed? That can be in the form of webinars, in-person events. Contractors, I would say these days, tend to like webinars because it's hard for them to get off the job to come sit in a room. So making sure that you have multiple options for delivering that is going to be key. And then I'll just note that DOE is developing some training resources for this program. So that'll be a good foundation for you to work from. And then if you're making any decisions within the allowable parameters, then you'll want to sort of add those elements to it. Next slide. So in addition to program requirements and sort of logistical things, you'll want to identify if there's any technical training needs. Most contractors that are working in the energy efficiency space already are going to have a fairly good foundation of building science, maybe health and safety if they're working in a program that allows for health and safety measures. So if you're tapping into the weatherization service provider network, there's a pretty robust health and safety protocol and funding source there. So contractors and auditors that work in that are going to understand that stuff. But if it's contractors and auditors that are maybe working in utility programs, there may be some training needs around that. There might be some technology specific needs like heat pumps if you're trying to engage the HVAC market, and that's a goal for you to use these funds for some more electrification, decarbonization work. There's still a lot of training to do in the market in the HVAC industry on heat pumps. So understanding your network that you're building and what kind of specific technology training they might need. And then installation best practices. This is going to vary by trade. For example, heat pumps, you're going to want to make sure that there are protocols for setup and installation. For insulation, air sealing, you're going to want to make sure that there are best practices for all the different specific air sealing techniques and maybe some insulation material applications. The weatherization provider network is probably going to have some good protocols, and hopefully some of the utility programs would too. So hopefully you can capitalize on that, but you'll want to understand what are they used to doing, and then are there some higher level best practices. The Building Performance Association, BPI, DOE and other more national entities have put together best practice installation guides. So that can be a really good resource if you're working in a market where that hasn't been pervasive. Quality assurance protocols. I'll get into this a little bit more on whether this is going to be part of your work or not, a part of this program. But if there is quality assurance involved, meaning some additional inspection that's required to sort of understand that that project is complete, you're gonna want to train the contractors on what those inspection protocols are so that they go into the job understanding what they'll be measured against. And then software and diagnostic testing. So this is going to be a little bit more focused on the auditor side. There are some specific software listed in the program requirements, but there's also some options for states to develop on their own. So depending on the network that you develop, they may or may not be used to the specific software that you're planning to use for this. So getting some training resources for any new software for practitioners, as well as any particular diagnostic testing if you plan to put in some protocols around that. Next slide. So I just want to plug, this is not a super long-term program. So you're probably not going to do a lot of workforce development within this program, but if you are in a market where you have some significant trades gaps. Let's say, for example, you have a very robust HVAC contractor network, but very few insulation contractors, for example. You're going to want to figure out if there are other resources that you can tap into to help develop that trade workforce. There are many efforts going on right now and continuing to have more and more funding come out for workforce development, both for bringing in new workers, but also upskilling existing workers. So, partner with other people in the state. So the workforce system in your state, we're seeing that our economic development department in Minnesota is starting to have more and more funds that are focused on clean energy career development. So, and I know in our state, a lot of the agencies can be somewhat siloed, and I think this is a really great opportunity to connect with those agencies that might have some funding sources for contractor upskilling or new participants in the workforce. And then if there's any utility program efforts as well. And then connect your contractor network that does exist to programs that are maybe developing workers, because likely with all this federal money, a lot of the contractors that exist are going to have to expand. And so they're going to need more workers. And if they can tap into other training programs that are developing workers, that's going to make all of this go a little faster. I'm noting this Minnesota example. This is a program that we've been running for about 2.5 years. As an organization, we have money from a major utility, Xcel Energy, as well as a city and a county that have funded a program. And this is a really holistic workforce development approach to bring in new workers into the system. It's an opportunity to focus those recruiting efforts on engaging BIPOC and women residents of areas of concentrated poverty, typically people who are underrepresented in the trades. And what we've found to be really successful is, again, partnerships. So it's a great theme for this webinar series, but really a holistic design. A lot of times I think people think of workforce development as just the training portion, but whether it's upskilling contractors and their current staff or bringing new people into the workforce, it's going to be very important to have trusted voices reaching out to them, understanding individual needs and support services, as well as the technical training, but then some on-the-job experience and then eventually job placement. So I just wanted to note that there are efforts going on around the country and do a little bit of recon to see what's happening in your state. All right, next slide. Okay, so now that you've got your contractor networks, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can start to design within the parameters of the program, something that might be a little bit more auditor and contractor friendly. Next slide. So as Greg mentioned, it's going to be really important for you to solicit input and feedback from these key partners early on. They're going to have some expertise in the market, what's already going on, what are they used to doing, how do they approach certain specific details, so that you don't end up designing something that isn't usable by them, or they're not interested in participating in. And I will say that with all of the money that's coming for energy efficiency work, which is fantastic, you're competing against other programs for these contractor and auditor networks. So it's going to be important that you make it really user-friendly, and get their input early so that you don't have to change things later. Obviously, you need to make sure that the program is designed within the parameters of the program, but that also can be met by your existing workforce so that you don't have to spend a huge amount of time just getting them to those protocols. So what certifications do they already have? Would they fit within DOE's requirements? Because there is a fair amount of flexibility with those requirements. So think about what they're already doing, what certifications, what standards are they meeting, and then see how much you can align with that. If at this point you do identify barriers, so maybe there are no certifications for a particular trade or an auditor pool, work with them to figure out what is the best and quickest solution to meet the criteria so that you don't have to get stuck in this phase. And then, of course, think through the value proposition. Like I said, you're going to be competing for contractors with all of these programs that are coming out. And so think through what is helping them sell jobs, and what logistical things are in place that might make it not worth their effort, and try to minimize those. And then again, getting input and feedback on this design phase will really help the implementation go a lot more smooth. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm just going to talk about some specific topics for discussion. That was sort of a high level, like how do you make this more contractor friendly? And now I'm going to just get into some of the details that I've had experience going through. What I've found is there's a lot of high level conception phase for program design. And then once you get into really deploying it, you start to realize there's all these specific details that you need to sort of think through. And the more that you can think through them before you deploy, the better the process is going to go. In terms of contractors and auditors, think through whether you're going to do maybe an RFP that gives you a pool of specific contractor firms or auditing companies, or is it just going to be a threshold that whoever's working in this program needs to meet a specific certification? Maybe it's a terms and conditions agreement. You're going to want to make sure they have some education on what this program is, so that if there are protocols and reporting documentation, that you're working with contractors and auditors who understand that. So even in this sort of second bullet point where it's like, okay, they have to meet X certification, you're still going to want to have some engagement with them and some education. And so doing some broader outreach is going to be important if you're not selecting specific companies. You want to think about what a particular project process and timeline is going to be. You'll likely have a shorter timeline for residential than you will for commercial, but that can depend on your contractor and auditor pool, as well as the complexity of the project. You'll want to understand what kind of lead time your auditors need. Do they need a couple weeks so that they can schedule? Can they do a quick turnaround and say, as soon as we get this information about a client, we'll be out there in a couple of days? So understand what their lead time is. And similarly with contractors, once the scope of work is ready, how fast can the contractor get out there? What's the duration of the project? Is it multiple contractors? Are you going to have a general contractor that's subbing out, or is it a mix of individual trades partners? And then what's the sequence of the project? Are there any items that need to be done before the next item? I know in the low-income weatherization program, there's often a protocol to do HVAC before doing insulation air sealing, so that we know that we have systems that are working properly, don't have health and safety issues before tightening up the building. So think through if there's any sequencing that you need to plan out. And I would say ask those contractors and auditors that you're engaging to understand maybe what they run up against or what other programs do. And then what, again, is the turnaround time for an audit? Typically, turnaround times for residential is fairly quick, but large multifamily and commercial can sometimes take a month or so for the analysis to be done. So maybe the on-site work is a day or two, but then actually developing the report with the recommendations can take a little bit longer. Next slide. Again, I've mentioned this a few times, but as much as you can plan your program to align with other programs, that's going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to leverage other potential resources that a customer might be able to get, whether that's grants or rebates, or potentially some other capital stack items. So anything you can do to align with other programs is going to help make it easier for contractors and auditors to say, yes, I want to participate because I already know how to do this. So that's going to be things like certification criteria, software, scope of work development protocols, like what measures are getting chosen. Is that similar to utility program incentives, for example? And what in those systems works well and what doesn't work well. Maybe you would have the opportunity to get rid of some things that aren't working well for these partners. Hopefully you can work with them together on that. Again, what software is currently being used? There are some listed software that is approved by DOE, but then there are some optional items for states to decide, things that are equivalent. So if you find that the things that are listed are not what your current networks are using, it might be worth going through a process to understand what they are using and whether that's equivalent and could be approved by DOE. So I would say definitely look into that. There isn't necessarily a standard set of software across the country. There's a few common ones in residential. There may be a smaller pool of software that's used in commercial, but find that out so that you don't end up requiring something that these practitioners aren't used to using. Again, alignment for current software that they're using. And then what are the standard protocols that they typically use for recommending measures? There are some requirements for this program, but they're fairly broad. And so coming up with more specifics is going to be helpful. You know, maybe there's a suite of things that could improve the carbon footprint or lower bills, but how are things chosen? Is it based on equipment age? Is it based on air leakage of the existing structure? So thinking through those very specific details that help whoever's developing the scope of work decide what the best recommendation is going to be. And I will say that the Weatherization Assistance Program has some specific protocols. A lot of utility programs have some specific protocols. For example, in some utility programs leading to that cost effectiveness threshold, they'll only incentivize insulation work if the existing insulation is below a certain level. So thinking through what those are, and if that's a barrier, maybe you can do something a little bit more lenient. And if it's working really well, maybe you align with that. On the work scope development, I think it'll be really important for you to understand who is developing the scopes of work. This could be done by an auditor. This could be done by the contractor or several contractors. There could be a third-party administrator. There could be a general contractor that's developing the scope of work and then subbing it out to the specific trades. I don't see a lot of states developing scopes of work, but that's possible. So thinking through who is developing that for these loan products, are there decisions that a customer can make, or is it really related to the results of the audit? So thinking through that is going to be really helpful for you to talk through. Maybe there's already decisions that you've made as the state energy office. And then who ensures that that work scope is then comprehensive and complete? Is it based on a very specific set of decision tree matrices, or is this broad, as a little bit broader that DOE has recommended? And then there's maybe some sort of step that evaluates that scope of work to make sure that it's meeting the needs of the program and making sure that it's comprehensive and not missing something that's critical. All right, next slide. I mentioned quality assurance and quality control. This is going to be something that I would typically recommend if budgets allow. It really can help ensure project success. Quality assurance is typically referred to as the maybe a third party that's going out to inspect the work. Quality control is more of an internal controls process by contractors, like what process did they have to ensure that equipment is installed in the right way. And then maybe there's an inspection protocol, whether that's every single project or maybe a sampling of project. Maybe that's by contractor. So you understand, okay, this contractor, we've been out to 10% of their jobs and all of them look great. I think we can trust that they're doing similar work across the portfolio. That's something to take into consideration. If there's already programs that maybe you're leveraging that have quality assurance as part of the program, that would be a great thing to utilize. And then it's going to be really important that the auditors and contractors understand what they're going to be measured against. So if the quality assurance inspector is looking for a suite of things that the contractor didn't realize was part of their scope, that's going to cause tension and make it so that it's not very contractor friendly. We have found when we have quality assurance protocols that are really well communicated up front and on an ongoing basis, contractors actually really like having quality assurance inspections because owners of contracting companies can't necessarily be on every job. So they actually take they like that there's somebody else checking on the job for them, because in the end, if something goes wrong, they probably have some sort of warranty for a customer. So I'd encourage, if it's going to be part of the program, to make sure there's some good open communication, feedback loop, et cetera. And just noting that a lot of times code inspection, so if pulling permits is required in either a city or a state, they don't necessarily always check for performance based, thresholds for energy efficiency measures. They're really focused on kind of life safety and some other sort of code requirements. So we haven't found the ability to rely on code inspections across all measures to be reliable. So just wanted to note that. And then I'm going to switch on to the project completion expectations. So I mentioned this a little bit, but what is the overall timing that you're expecting between project start and finish, making sure that that's clearly communicated to contractors, as well as getting their feedback about, okay, if you're going to install this type of system, what's the typical time frame that this takes? Is it a range of 1 day to 5 days? Is it 4 hours to 2 days? What are you experiencing in the field, so that you as the administrator, the program owner, can make sure that you're not setting things up for failure or having too long of time thresholds. And then this is probably a part of the conversation that I would encourage is between your lender partners and your contractors, are who is getting paid from the loan. Is the loan product going directly to the contractor? Is it getting reimbursed to the customer who has paid the contractor? So thinking about that payment cycle, and then are there expectations that need to be met before that payment can get dispersed? So is there a quality assurance inspection that needs to take place before payment can get dispersed? Is it just assurance that the project is complete? Is there a code inspection that's required? So thinking through those particular process items will be important. And then for complaint resolution and dispute process, there's always going to be things that happen here and there. Hopefully most of the time, innocent mistakes. This is why quality assurance is a very helpful process to catch some of those just basic mistakes that sometimes happen. But in the end, there may be some bigger issues that happen. And so thinking through what is the complaint process, dispute process, is that go to the lending partner? Does that go directly to the contractor? Does that go to you as the state energy office or program administrator? So what does that look like? And make sure that that, again, is clearly communicated both to the end user, but also all of the partners that are involved. And then are there provisions in your agreements with contractors or the lender's agreements with contractors that clearly state what the expectations are when there is a complaint or a dispute? Oftentimes with programs that I have run, we have a general expectation that anything we find either in a quality assurance inspection or from a customer complaint is resolved within 2 weeks. Every once in a while, that timeline isn't realistic and we adjust, but understanding what that timeline might look like and what's reasonable, it would be a good conversation to have with contractors, and maybe what parameters might be in place that would go outside of whatever you've decided. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I just want to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about this value proposition a bit more. So it's going to be important to utilize your contractor network to sell the lending product. Some contractors are better at this than others. Kind of depends on what their sales process is. But oftentimes, if it's a large project, it's going to be really helpful for them to sell the job if they can bring really attractive financing to the table. Where you're going to get very excited contractors is if you have a very easy process for them to utilize. So a lot of the things we've already covered, make sure that you're getting the sense of like, is this usable by you? How can we make it faster and easier, but still have quality embedded? Is the loan going to be dispersed quickly, whether that goes to the contractor or the customer? And then does the program cover any other costs like potentially audits? And if so, is that covered up front? Can it be rolled into the loan? Things like that. Hopefully the loan terms are going to be better than existing alternatives. So maybe a little bit of a landscape analysis on the interest rates that you're planning and see how competitive they are with other products in your market. And that's going to vary by different markets. Making sure that this contractor and auditor network is engaged and that stays engaged and has a good feedback loop. So if they run into things that weren't maybe thought of in the design process, that they have a good line to discuss any changes that they would be interested in, that you have the ability to actually make those changes. So providing frequent training, education, and engagement with them is going to be really helpful for you. And then just, providing some resources and collaterals that can help them sell the product as well. If there's a way for contractors to sign up customers online for lending and get pre-approved, that is super useful. We started doing that at our organization maybe 6-7 years ago. And we find that contractors really like that when they're selling a job, a customer can go online, quickly see if they would be pre-approved for a lending product. It just helps them understand their financial impact right when they're at the table with a contractor. Okay, next slide. So in summary, just sort of some high level recommendations for me as you're working on this. Really engage with these practitioners early. The more on board, the more friendly this is for them, the more successful the program's going to be. Make sure that you stay connected and still have a feedback loop beyond just this initial phase. And trust their expertise. A lot of these contractors and auditors have been doing this for many years, many decades. So understand what they're seeing, but also know when to push back. If there are things that you either have to do because of the funding source from DOE, say this is kind of a non-negotiable, or your expertise with what the communities need. Make sure that you're developing that value proposition with them and for them to make sure that they have a reason to want to utilize this product for their customers, and then make it as aligned as possible with other programs. Again, just can't reiterate that enough. As more and more money is coming into this work, there's so much that I think so much potential for us to align so that we're not recreating the wheel every time we have a new bucket of funds. So that is the end of my slides. I can either take questions now, or maybe just I'll have a plug for people putting questions in the chat. But then Greg has some sort of wrap up slides as well. So just sort of a early prompt to put in questions that you might have.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Becky. That was really great. I was right to be excited about it. And I did want to add one piece which is that Becky was talking about. One thing that a lot of programs will do is to rely on or at least use contractor networks as a way to drive the uptake of their program offerings. We have through SCEP, we have a report coming out, Berkeley Lab does, on this very subject, hits on a number of the topics that Becky was discussing, and that should be out in the coming weeks. So look forward to that. But I did want to, before we go to Q&A, talk a little bit about some other resources that are available, because there are a bunch of really great resources available. So the first two are SCEP grant programs. You see here the state-based home energy efficiency contractor trading grants. These are formula grants that are going to be coming out that can help you with training, reducing the cost of trainings, and providing testing and certification of contractors, and partnering with the nonprofits on either of these. In addition to that, there's a second grant program, the Energy Auditor Training Program, which will be a competitive grant award. Oh, I should have said that the applications, more importantly, for the first one, are due on July 12th of this year. So be looking for that. The second one, the applications are also due on July 12th. And the second one, the Energy Auditor Training Program, is grants to train individuals to conduct audits or surveys of commercial and residential buildings. So two grant programs. And then something that Becky alluded to earlier, there are contractor and auditor training resources. So RLF team is developing resources to support state offices on training both contractors and auditors on the program itself, on the RLF capitalization grant program, including a slide template and a training recording, which will go over program requirements, commercial and residential energy audits, and RLF upgrades and retrofits. So these will be available in the RLF resource library, and will be shared this summer. So the link is here when these are posted, so that folks can take a look at those. And then finally, although this is there are a lot more resources available, including the RLF Energy Audit Guide, the RLF Technical Assistance resources that I talked about earlier, that has a link to a bunch of different resources, including a link that where you can request technical assistance. And then there are DOE and National Lab auditor contractor resources, including professional home energy assessments, the Residential Energy Auditor Resource Repository, the Building Science Education Solutions Center. And then there are also audit tools like the audit template, which is a DOE commercial audit software, and a home energy score, which is a residential scoring methodology. So with that, I am going to, I will open it up for questions. You can put your questions, as Becky was saying, in the chat or in a Q&A, but the first question is from Leah Wilkes. can you talk about the role of regional community college programs, tribal colleges, or apprenticeship programs?
So may I take that?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be in the suite of ongoing workforce development efforts to tap into. Um, Apprenticeship programs tend to be tied to union pathways. What I found in our market is a lot of residential projects are not done by union contractors, but of course, more of the larger scale projects, multifamily and commercial, likely have more union contractors. So tapping into those pools of education resources and worker pipelines can be helpful, especially if you're reaching out to contractors or other firms that say, we'd love to do this. We have the knowledge base, but we don't have enough workers to sort of build up the capacity. Connecting with them with these educational institutions can be really helpful. Tribal colleges, community colleges are really great for some trades, particularly HVAC and electrical. Not so much envelope or carpenter necessarily, especially if they're working on smaller buildings. So understanding sort of the breadth of trades that they're actually training for, and then some might have a better pipeline to contractors for their students to get placed into, and then that might be a nice contractor pool for you to tap into, and others may not have quite that uh, line into actual employment. And so then it'd be a little bit more about understanding their engagement. How much do they want to connect with the contractors that you're engaging with?
And so you were talking, Becky, about sort of doing a survey, making sure that you have the expertise out there that you need. Is this, I'm wondering if this would be part of it, is even if you do have gaps here and there,
Mhm.
trying to see if there are institutions out there that are working on those gaps before you might start a program yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think given the timeline of this and wanting to get funds out, starting a whole workforce effort on your own might be too daunting to sort of get the full work done. And so tapping into existing programs, whether that's community colleges, trade schools, or existing workforce efforts that are more and more happening either through the state or local workforce systems, or individually in, from federal funding, from state funding.
Thanks so much. Second question, and you touched on this a little bit. In your experience, do contractors have a preference as to who pays them? You talked about that as consideration. For example, payment from homeowner versus payment from utility, financial institution, or other.
I don't know if it's necessarily a preference on who pays them. I think it's how fast can the payment get to them, right? So that I think is going to help you decide what makes the most sense. In our lending work, we have products where we pay the homeowner directly once they can show that they've paid the contractor, and then others that have a pool of contractors we work with and we pay them directly. So it kind of depends on um, do you have a more specific pool of contractors that you're going to work with in this program? And so then maybe you can come
Mm.
up with some payment agreements through your contracting process, or is it very open-ended, like as long as customer you work with a contractor that he has these credentials, then it might be more cumbersome to actually pay all of these different contractors separately from a program administration standpoint. The other thing to consider is if there is some sort of threshold that needs to be met before disbursement goes out. So if there's a quality assurance inspection that's required, or some sort of protocol that says the project is complete, then that might determine, probably lean towards the program paying the contractor directly versus communicating that with the customer that they can't pay them until this happens. So I think you'll have to think through some of these other categories of process ideas before maybe making that determination. But I think from a contractor perspective, they're just going to say, the fastest I can get paid for the work, the better. Makes
Thanks
sense.
so much.
This is, yeah.
Thanks a lot. If folks have other questions, please put them in the chat. But I do have one question for you, Becky. One thing that I was wondering is just what these partnerships look like. I'm assuming that they are, I'll just tell you what it looks like in my mind is that for auditors, generally there is a contractual arrangement between the program administrator and the auditor. And then when it comes to contractors, it's more along the lines of they are approved from the program for the program if there's an approval list or something like that, but perhaps not a direct contract.
I think that's certainly one program model that is popular across the country. But I will say that it does vary. For example, there are a lot of residential home performance contractors in some markets where they do the audit themselves. They can do HVAC, insulation,
Mm,
air sealing. And so there may be more of a consolidated effort. There may be an implementer that has so my organization, I have 35 auditors on staff. So it may be more like the agreement is between the administrator and a third party implementer where the audit is done at that point, and then there's even some management of a contractor network by that entity versus having to kind of go back and forth a lot. So there are different models across the country. I just urge each state to understand kind of the lay of the land. And, if you think you're going to be doing more commercial focused things or more residential or multifamily in the mix, even between those different sectors, there's going to be different program models just from a scale standpoint. The larger the building that you get, the more sophisticated of a contractor you're going to have working on those projects. And so it might be that you work more directly with those contractor companies for a commercial project, for example.
gotcha. And are auditors usually also contractors, or does it
It
just depend?
varies. It really
Gotcha.
varies across the country. In Minnesota, not often for residential. We've got separate auditors, separate contractors. In New
Okay.
York State, almost all of the auditors are part of a contracting company, and the
Mm,
contractors themselves do the audits. It just kind of depends on, I guess, like for lack of a better phrase, like how the state grew up in terms of energy
yeah.
efficiency, and like was the value on that sort of separation, neutral
Mm,
third party, or was the value on quick deployment? And that's kind of how the markets have evolved differently.
gotcha. Well, we are coming up to the top of the hour. I just want to thank you again, Becky. I thought this was great. And thanks to everyone who joined us. Like I said, we will be posting the slides and this recording in the next few days. And I hope everyone has a great day.